To this session called Just the Fax, Ma'am, adding user-friendly, secure, cloud-based faxing to your desktop apps using HttpClient, RestClient, and WebBrowser. In this session, we'll look at techniques for interacting with a REST API to do the following operations: send an outbound fax, confirm the delivery of the fax, and retrieve the fax image of a delivered fax. We'll look at example PowerBuilder code that does the above functions, and this code will be available as part of this session. And we'll look at UI tips for integrating an outbound fax feature into your own desktop applications. My name's Ronnie Poe. I'm a longtime PowerBuilder and SQL developer. I'm a consultant, and I've developed a healthcare application called Chartbase that I sell to occupational healthcare clinics. So why is faxing still important when it seems like an old technology? Faxes are universally accepted methods of delivering documents securely. Many businesses, such as pharmacies, rely on incoming faxes, and they won't accept emails containing protected information. There are federal privacy laws which protect healthcare information, known as HIPAA, and the fax industry has done well to keep pace with those requirements. They've developed a standard set of practices which are considered HIPAA compliant. Other secure delivery methods, such as encrypted email or downloading from a secure portal, are more cumbersome than simply faxing. Why use an internet-based fax service? You won't need to invest in any special hardware or software. It's available as a low-cost service or subscription, and you don't need to wait around for the fax to send. You send the document to your fax service vendor, and your vendor converts it into a fax and delivers it over a conventional phone line. And it's HIPAA compliant if certain requirements are met. So how do you choose a fax service? These are the basic requirements. It has to use encryption, which today means TLS 1.2. It has to require user authentication, which means a username and password. The easiest thing to do is just to look for a statement of HIPAA compliance, which means that they follow certain practices, such as physical security of their data center, audit controls so you can track who's had access to a piece of protected information. Also, you want to look for a vendor that will enter into a business associate agreement with you, which is basically a boilerplate agreement that spells out each party's responsibility with respect to the protected healthcare information. And you want to look for a vendor that offers a REST API. The examples here use Upland Interfax's REST API, so if you want to follow along, you'll need to register with Interfax for a free developer account. I'm not intending to endorse Interfax in any way. I just happen to have a client who is already using them, but they may not be the most cost-effective solution for your particular situation. There are many vendors that meet all their requirements and offer a REST API, so I'd encourage you to check out all the options. Getting started, you'll need to register for a developer account. And the website is www.interfax.net, and I think it will guide you to the appropriate website for your country. Or if you're choosing another vendor, find the appropriate link for your vendor and country. With Interfax, faxing with a developer account is free with some limitations. And if you're new to web services, but you're an experienced PowerBuilder developer, here's just a quick review or a quick introduction to the basic parts of a request and a response. So for a request, you need the endpoint, which is the URL, including any query parameters. And the method for sending and checking up on faxes will mostly be doing post and get. The headers, which is additional instructional information, metadata that goes in the request, and the request body. And so in PowerBuilder, we're going to interact with these parts of the request using HttpClient and RestClient. And both of those objects have methods, such as setRequestHeader and sendRequest for HttpClient. And for RestClient, there's setRequestHeader and retrieve, which allows you to retrieve a web service into a DataWindow control. And looking at a response, we want to look at the response code, the response headers, and the response body. And in PowerBuilder, we'll use HttpClient methods, getResponse status code, getResponse header, and getResponse body. Let's look at some documentation for a post request. Every vendor documents things a little differently, but hopefully you'll find something that looks a little bit like this. This is our endpoint. This is the path of our desired resource or operation. And these are the query parameters. And there'll be a separate section that describes what each of these parameters do. This is the method. These are the headers, which are name value pairs. And this is the request body. And as I mentioned in the agenda, we're going to look at three essential operations here. One is sending a fax, and we're going to send either a single document or multiple documents together as a single fax to a single destination. It will confirm delivery of the fax, and we'll retrieve an image of the fax once it's confirmed. So from the documentation, here's how we send a fax. There's the endpoint, there's the query parameters. Here's our authorization header, which means we're going to use basic authentication. We'll talk about that in a second. This is the content type header, or the MIME type, where we define what's going to be in the body, which we will place in a blob variable. For basic authentication, we're going to use base 64 encoding of a string containing the user ID and password separated by a colon. We're going to use HttpClient to set up the request and to send it. Let's look at a PowerBuilder example for sending a fax. This is using basic authentication, and this is our user ID and password. We declare our variables. We're going to use a coder object to do the base 64 encoding, and we're going to use HttpClient to send the request. And let's look at building our URL using URL encoding of the query parameters. The parameter name is fax number. The parameter value is the actual fax number with a +1 at the beginning. And we're going to use the coder object and call the URL encode method using the parameter name and the parameter value. And that's how we're going to build our URL. So to actually send the fax, we're going to read a PDF document into a blob variable. So here's our file open, our file read into a blob. Then we're going to use HttpClient and set the request header content type to application PDF. And then we're going to call send request using a post method. We'll send our URL and we'll send the blob containing the PDF document. And then to interpret the response, let's look at the documentation. So if successful, a 201 created status is returned, and the HTTP location header contains the URI of the newly created fax resource. So this is a response header called location, and the value contains a unique identifier, which we'll use to track the fax status. So in PowerBuilder, we're going to use HttpClient's getResponse status code and getResponse header methods. So here's a PowerBuilder example. If HttpClient.getResponse status code equals 201, then we're going to call getResponse header to get the location header value, which resembles something like this. And then we're going to parse out this last piece to use as our fax identifier, which we'll use to track the status of this. All right, let's look at a demo of all this. Here's a local PDF file that I want to send as a fax. Let's take a look at that. And here is a sample app. Let's look at the code behind this command button. So I won't go line by line, but we're going to use coder object and HttpClient, and I'll just point out some sections. This block of text, block of code here, we're using to build this URL. And this section sets up basic authentication using our user ID and password. And here we read that PDF document into a blob variable. We set request header. We set the content type to application PDF. And here's where we send the request. We check the return code. And if it's good, we get the location response header and parse out the fax ID from that. And then we're going to display that fax ID in this single line edit. So let's do this. Let's run it in debugger mode, and we can see what happens. Okay, so there's our URL. We'll just kind of step over things. All right, we set up basic authentication. We're going to read our file, send the request. So that just took a second. The return code is good. Let's grab the location header and parse out that fax identifier. And there we go. So that's our unique fax identifier. That means our request was successful. And what we'll do is check back later to see if the delivery of that fax was successful. Let's look at sending multiple files as one fax. Here's the documentation. And the thing that's going to be different here is the content type header will be multi-part mixed, and we'll define a boundary. And the boundary can be any string that is unique within the body. So you can use it to mark off sections. And so our request body is going to look like this. We're going to take the different parts here and concatenate it into one blob. So let's look at the PowerScript for that. We're going to set the request header content type to multi-part mixed with our boundary definition. We're going to read the PDF document into a blob. Read the Word document into a different blob. Then we're going to build our request blob by just concatenating all those different sections. And we won't go line by line, but you can get the gist of what's happening. And then we'll call send request, a post method with a URL, and that blob containing 2 documents. Now let's take a look at a demo of that. Okay, here are 2 documents that we want to send. Here's a Word document containing a cover sheet template and that same PDF document. And let's look at the code behind this button. So again, I won't go line by line, but here we're setting up the URL, setting up basic authentication, defining our boundary, and setting the request content type header. I'm going to read one document into a blob, read the second document into a blob, and then concatenate both blobs along with the boundary definitions into our request blob. I'm going to send the request, check the return status, and if it's successful, I'm going to parse out that unique fax identifier and set the single line edit text. So this time let's just run it. So it comes back. I see our fax identifier, so I know that the send request was successful. Let's look at how to check the status of those outbound faxes. So according to the API documentation, to get a completed fax list, this time we're going to do a GET request, and we're going to pass a list of fax ID values as a query parameter. So our URL will look like this, and our response will be an array of outbound fax structures. And here's a definition of the structure. And we can retrieve this into a data window control using the RestClient. If we create a data window object with column names and data types matching the outbound fax structure elements. So here's the data window object. And then we're going to use the RestClient and set the request header. And instead of calling send request, we're going to call it retrieve, passing in the data window control as an argument. So here's how we would do that in PowerScript. We're going to use coder object, and RestClient will set up the URL as before. We'll set up basic authentication as before, call set request header, and then we're going to call retrieve using a data window control as an argument. So let's take a look at that. Here's our data window control with columns that match the fax structure. Now let's look at the code behind this command button. So we're going to use coder object and RestClient. We're going to set up our query parameter using the fax identifiers in those single line edit controls. We'll set up the URL and set up basic authentication. Then we're going to call the retrieve method using the data window control and the URL. And let's just see that. When we press this button, we'll send a request containing these two fax IDs, and we should get a result set back. There we go. So there's a result set showing that these two faxes were successfully delivered. Let's take a look at how to get the image of these faxes. According to the documentation, we're going to send a GET request, and we're going to include the fax ID in the URL path. And if successful, the response body will contain a TIFF image file. So we're going to use HttpClient. We're going to use these methods, set request header, send request, and get response body. So let's look at some PowerScript. I'm going to skip the variable declarations and basic authentication that we've already looked at. This is our URL. We send the request, we get response body into a blob variable, and then we write that blob to an image file. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so here we have the fax IDs that we've successfully sent and that we've confirmed as having been delivered. And let's take a look at the code behind this button. So there's our coder object, HttpClient, credentials, setting up basic authentication. There's our URL, which includes the fax ID. Send request, get method, get the response body into a blob variable, and then we're going to open a file and write the contents of that blob into the file. And if we look at the other button, it's doing the exact same thing, just using a different fax ID. So let's take a look. Here's a local directory, and there's a subdirectory called image. And if we look at the code, we're going to write the retrieved image into this directory. So let's take a look at this while we're running the code. So this is the first fax, which is a single document. I'll do a get image. And we notice this image popped up. Let's take a look at it. It's a TIFF image. So there's our first fax image. And if we do a get image for the second fax ID, There's our multi-page fax image. So that's it. We've looked at how to send a fax, how to check the status of a fax, and how to get the image of the delivered fax. So using those three functions, we can build an integrated fax solution into an existing PowerBuilder app. Here are just a few tips that you might find useful. Make faxing as easy as printing. After successfully sending a fax, save the fax ID in a database table to make it easier to track. Create a separate application that runs continually and uses a timer event to check periodically for new faxes that are pending confirmation. On confirmation, retrieve the fax image. Some users like to see an image of the fax on a confirmation receipt. And here's a final demo of an existing app with a built-in outbound fax feature. Let's just pull up a printable report. Okay, so I'm going to choose fax from this menu, and what's going to happen behind the scenes, I'm going to save that report as a PDF in a temporary folder, and I'm going to pass the path of that PDF to the fax window. I'm showing the user a context-aware fax number lookup screen. So I'm going to pick this fax number. I'm using a web browser control to preview the outbound fax. I give the user the option to include a cover sheet, and if they do that, I show them another data window with editable fields that are pre-populated with context-aware information. And if the user chooses to include a cover sheet, then I save the cover sheet as a separate PDF, and I'll fax them together. When I hit the send button, I'm just going to call those methods that we examined earlier. And I can view the status of that outbound fax, either here or in a global fax status area. If I double-click here, the fax shows as pending. I can no longer access the cover sheet. I can only preview. Let's look at a separate app that's meant to run separately on a different computer, and that logs in periodically, checks for any outbound faxes that need delivery confirmation, and if it finds one, it tries to retrieve the status of that outbound fax. It won't come back with anything until the fax is actually delivered. It'll repeat this process until delivery is confirmed or a certain number of attempts have been made. Okay, a few minutes have passed. Let's run that app again. Okay, so this time, the app was successfully able to check the status and retrieve the image of the fax. So now if we run our main app, if I check the global status screen, I see that the fax has been successfully sent. If I drill down, I can see the fax in context. And if I double-click again, I can see a confirmation sheet that has an image of the first page of the fax. And I also have access to the entire fax image that was sent and that we've retrieved. And just a quick note that because the fax image is a TIFF file, I can't use the web browser control to display it. I have to use a different TIFF viewer. So that wraps up this session. I hope you found some useful tips in it, and I want to say thank you.